Ladies and gentlemen, will the congregation please rise?
Good evening, everyone. Please take your seats. So a very, very warm welcome to everybody in the room here and to those online to this very special occasion, the inaugural lecture of Professor Vishwas Satgar, or as he's affectionately known as, Vish. And just to also make special mention of Vishwas's family members who are here, his partner, Professor Michelle Williams, and his brother, who I believe has flown up from Pietermaritzburg, Kiran Satgar, and then I believe his sister, who is at UCT, Ujala Satgar, is online. So welcome, everybody. But of course, welcome to all of Vishwas's friends, family, colleagues. Really very lovely to have you here. So just to introduce you to the procession that walked in, I'm Professor Lynn Morris. I am the DVC of Research and Innovation here at WITS. Ahead of me, and you'll hear from the deans shortly, Professor Mucha Musenwa, the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Lorena Nunez Carrasco, who is the head of the School of Social Sciences, of course our inaugurating professor that you'll hear from shortly, and then Professor Colleen Vogel from the Faculty of Science, who will be doing the vote of thanks. So wonderful to have you all here. Inaugural lectures are really a very important event in the life of a university because they really signal the pinnacle of an academic career. The entry into the professoriate, and what that means is you get to join Senate and you get to make important decisions about the future of the university. But of course, today is an opportunity to hear from our inaugurating professor about the work that he has done over the last, he's been at WITS for 15 years, and to hear about the impact of his work. And of course, these are more general lectures, and so it's an opportunity to profess and educate and tell us. And so to introduce our inaugurating professor, I'd like to invite Professor Mucha Musenwa to do the introductions. Thank you.
A very, very good afternoon to you all, and thank you for coming to this inaugural lecture. I'm going to read a prepared short bio of Professor Vishwas Satgar. Make no mistake, his is a rich CV. So what you're going to hear here is just a snippet of his life. Dr. Vishwas Satgar teaches decolonial international relations. He is the editor of the Democratic Marxism series and principal investigator of emancipatory future studies in the Anthropocene. He has edited and co-edited 14 books, written one single-authored monograph, and co-authored a book. He has published 34 book chapters and 31 journal articles, including in several international journals. As an engaged public intellectual, he has written over 40 newspaper articles, popular magazine pieces, transformative praxis tools, and other policy-related materials. He has supervised 44 students from international relations, the Global Labor University Program, and development studies. Through his Emancipatory Futures project, he has provided a transdisciplinary space and supervision support to 35 students over the past 6 years. He has done cross-disciplinary teaching in development studies in the Global Labor University Program for over a decade. His international collaborations have spanned work on alternative think tanks, cooperatives, and solidarity economies, real utopias, the second coming of fascism, and mapping fossil fuel capital. His most recent international collaborations are with the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment linked to the United Nations Foundation, Green Transitions, with academics in Denmark and India, and on extreme heat impacts with Cambridge University's Existential Risk Center. He has received awards from the World Association for Political Economy for his editorship of the Democratic Marxism series, a Social Justice Award from the Universities of South Africa, and Human Sciences Research Council. The Ella Butt Visiting Professorship to Castle University and a Visiting Fellowship to Brown University's Advanced Research Institute on Equality. He co-founded and actively supports the Wits University Food Sovereignty Process, which meets the needs of hungry students and builds transformative capacities in communities. He is a veteran activist and co-founded the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign and the Climate Justice Charter Movement. I now have the honor to invite this scholar of many parts to come and address us in his inaugural lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lynn Morris, and the Dean, Prof. Mucha. It's also a pleasure to see many colleagues, friends, and students in the audience. This lecture reflects on 15 years of academic praxis, my contribution to the academy and society, which spans the conjuncture of US-led neoliberalization and the conjuncture of planetary crisis. In a recent contribution to the Boston Review, eminent African-American historian Robin D.G. Kelley poses the question, what is the role of intellectuals in the age of fascism and genocide? He poses this question courageously in the context in which universities and critical academics are being targeted by the Trump administration. Kelley's answer to the question he poses is simple: stand up for the truth. In this vein, I dedicate this lecture to the people of Palestine. There are over 300 million people in conflict zones in the world right now, including the United States. Climate extremes are ramifying through our planet, our biosphere is being poisoned, food systems are under stress, biological disasters continue, and millions are on the move on our planet, more than at any other time in modern human history. Many displaced as refugees. The stakes are high. Yet there seems to be a superficial normalcy about our planetary condition. My discipline, international relations, emerged after World War I with the promise of bringing peace to the world. Since then, we have had World War II, the Cold War with its attendant risks of nuclear annihilation, multiple localized conflicts, and the recent war on terror. Against the actual historical evidence, it is patently clear that a discipline entrenched in the academic division of labor and as part of the modern university system, shaping theories, images of the world, concepts, policies, and understandings of the international, has seriously come short. In his award-winning 3-volume study on modes of foreign relations and political economy, renowned neo-Gramscian scholar Kees van der Pil refers to international relations as the discipline of Western supremacy. Building on this theme, and in tonight's lecture, I want to talk to how, in my academic journey, I have understood the IR discipline and contributed to it in the South African context. The American President Woodrow Wilson, himself an academic, played a pivotal role in placing the discipline of international relations within the academic sphere. In the main, he was concerned with containing the Russian Revolution and trying to find ways to build a buffer of client states. Preceding this was Marxism, with its debates on imperialism and national self-determination, which occupied the space of thinking the international in the early 20th century. Towering above all, in my view, was Rosa Luxemburg, one of the leading theorists of the German Social Democratic Party, whose theory of imperialism was attempting to understand and explain how capitalist accumulation was implicated in war-making and colonial domination of the peripheries. However, the main template for Western IR has been the grid of nation-states. The nation-state form was conceived as a product of the 17th century, the 1648 Treaties of Westphalia, which established the principle of sovereign equality, and together with capitalist property relations, has become central to how the international should be thought and made. During the Cold War and decolonization, comparative politics, area studies, modernization theory, and rational choice became central to providing an epistemological approach to the international. After the Cold War and 2 decades of US unipolarity, globalization, clash of civilizations, and governing the state became central concerns of IR, including its subfield of international political economy. IR has a richer historiography as a discipline, but this, in brief, is the story about the birth and intellectual itinerary of hegemonic international relations as a discipline. There are various theoretical traditions of realism/neorealism, liberal/neoliberal institutionalism, and constructivism, which hold up this disciplinary framework and provide the canonical basis for this discipline. It is all too self-evident that the discipline of IR, particularly its hegemonic core, works with the Western supremacist imaginary, seeking to reproduce the dominance of Euro-America even in the peripheries. This is its imperial ambitions and central to what defines its coloniality. At the same time, its conceptions of the political are state-centric, with the international and political reduced to domains of the nation-state. For critical IR scholars like Buzan, all of this is summed up in the idea that the state makes war and war makes the state. But the state-centric is not the only limit of how hegemonic IR understands the political. It also occludes natural relations because it is anthropocentric theory, and neither does it appreciate the systemic crisis of capitalism and the scala magnitude of such a contemporary crisis. These are issues we will return to. From the literature, it is not clear when the decolonial turn happened in the discipline of international relations, and we shouldn't make the mistake of collapsing it to decolonial thinking coming out of Latin America. It would seem that dependency theory, world systems, post-colonial thought, and anti-racism, specifically challenges to the color line in international relations, contributed to this turn. The decolonial turn has engendered several decolonial strategies within the discipline. Over the past 2.5 decades, before FISMA's fall, the following decolonial strategies have been elaborated on the edges of the discipline. First, critique of the ontological primacy given to imperial dominance and violence as a normative good. Mainstream hegemonic international relations theory has naturalized the role of imperial power as the counter to a world in chaos or structurally necessary for a world order to prevail. Imperial power and its violence is legitimated. Second, questioning white supremacist thought, assumptions, and epistemological Eurocentrism that frames Western-led global modernity as the standard for being developed, civilized, and necessary to be conscripted to the imperial order. This linear telos is deeply imbricated in hegemonic international relations theory. Third, calling into question the objectification of countries in the global south as failed states, badly governed, and prone to big man politics, while such a gaze is not turned on Western states. Fourth, hegemonic international relations epistemology justifies patterns of inequality and unequal ecological exchange, which are considered givens and necessary for world order. This has been challenged, including the deeper implications for race, gender, and class. More generally, mainstream IR theory has been blind to ecological and natural relations, as stated above. And five, there are universal claims made on behalf of the US-led West, and which are supported by hegemonic international relations. These universal claims are actually particularist and are merely pan-Euro-American claims. Instead, I support the affirmation of genuine universal universalism, which is very different from the Latin American approach to decoloniality with its emphasis on pluriversality. Sixth, mainstream international relations is premised on the erasure of knowledge of the subaltern. Can the non-Euro-American think? This is a central challenge of decolonial scholars to the coloniality of international relations. As a consequence, this has led to creating space to bring in non-Western thought into international relations and to advance post-imperial conceptions of the international. However, while decolonial IR has provided important departures from hegemonic IR, it has not been adequate. It has not furnished a conception of world-making from below or agency of the subaltern. Moreover, like mainstream hegemonic IR, it also does not fully appreciate the scala levels of capitalist crisis. In this regard, drawing on and elaborating a critical theory approach, specifically a decolonial, eco-feminist, Marxist theoretical approach, has been crucial. This has provided a crucial ontological alternative to the state-centricism, ecological blindness, and failure to understand the planetary crisis dynamics of capitalism in hegemonic IR. However, the starting point to challenge hegemonic IR has been in my teaching praxis. This has been about transformative critique. While including decolonial IR strategies, it has also involved focusing on subaltern world-making from below, and with an understanding that social conditions and relations that seem naturalized and normal are often socially constructed, historically contingent, underpinned by power relations, and politically contested. It also attempts to historicize and make transparent the institutions that maintain these socio-ecological conditions. Moreover, transformative critique recognizes that social realities, structures, relations, and foreign policies are not predetermined or fixed, they can be changed. A host of social forces with agential capacities are important in understanding social change from a transformative critique perspective. In my teaching experience, I have taught South African foreign policy to undergraduates, an undergraduate course on US foreign policy, a postgraduate course on empire and the crisis of civilization, a postgraduate course on international development, and for over 10 years, a course on understanding global capitalism in the Global Labor University program. Some key decolonial highlights from these courses include the following. In the South African foreign policy course, the emphasis has been on thinking through the role of myriad social forces, bringing about the end of apartheid and making foreign policy. The role of Cuba, best captured in the documentary Cuba and African Odyssey, has been crucial to enable students to think about internationalism from the global South. But also recognize that South Africa was also caught up in the Cold War, and the Cold War ends in Africa with the assassination of Chris Hani on April 10, 1993. The crucial question in this course is whether South African foreign policy is counter-hegemonic or not. Is South African foreign policy for climate justice or not in the context of the planetary crisis? The US foreign policy course has highlighted its supremacist role in the world, but also highlighted the inconsistency between its liberal claims about freedom and democracy, while its international relations practices and domestic conditions reveal deep hypocrisy. Today, the US's role in supporting Israeli scholasticide, every university in Gaza has been bombed, famine and genocide is patently clear. The postgraduate course on empire and the crisis of civilization has unburdened these two macro categories from the historical Eurocentric uses and have analytically repurposed them to challenge the naturalizing of the Westphalian state-centric order. In other words, this course shows how anachronistic state-centered world orders are in longer spans of world historical time. Moreover, this course assists students in thinking the larger spatial scales of capitalism and the nature of systemic crisis today. The International Development course has highlighted the genealogy of development discourse and its imbrications with Euro-American world-making. The Understanding of Global Capitalism course historicizes the conjuncture of US-led neoliberal capitalism, its class project dynamics, its mechanisms of control and discipline, and what this means for Africa and trade union strategies. In short, I've been teaching decolonial international relations for 15 years at WITS. This has been about opening IR to other disciplinary influences such as world history, historical sociology, geopolitics, anthropology, and climate science, while also decentering the hegemonic IR canon. In a sense, the IR department has pluralized its offerings and added on decolonial aspects. However, this prompts me to ask these questions. Is decentering the IR canon enough? What more research, theoretical development, and teaching can be done to strengthen the decolonial turn? Should the core canon of Western hegemonic IR be spiked? Should the department work towards a decolonial canon such that hegemonic Western IR is simply a subfield or course offering? These are questions I'm fielding for further debate and collegial thinking in my department. In having these conversations, we have to be guided by the question about whether we want our teaching and research to serve the existing order or transform it. Unlike the world systems theorist Immanuel Wallerstein, in my work, I do not read the post-World War II order as characterized by one cycle of US hegemony. In fact, there have been two cycles of US hegemony, the first, the Pax Americana, and the second, US-led neoliberal governance. For about 4 decades, we have been living in the conjuncture of US-led neoliberal restructuring of the world economy. Increasingly, this has led to the sovereignty of capital prevailing over state-civil society complexes. The constitutionalizing of market democracies has given inordinate power to global finance and monopolies centered on the US. Globalization has been the process to bring this all about. In my PhD, I deal with how Africa was globalized from the outside and from within, a neo-dependency perspective, highlighting the agency of African ruling classes in bringing about Africa's insertion into global circuits of accumulation. The volume published by Southall and Melba posed the question of whether a new scramble for Africa was underway in the first decade of the 21st century. Drawing on my PhD, my contribution to this volume highlights the conjunctural defeat of Africa and radical Pan-Africanism and the emergence of a transnational fraction of the African ruling class, leading Afro-neoliberal class projects to integrate into global circuits of finance, production, and trade. These projects have given a local vernacular and idiom to neoliberalism while adjusting Africa to the terms of global monopoly capital, essentially giving African characteristics to neoliberalization. This is not the story of how Europe underdeveloped Africa, but how African rulers have been at the vanguard of wanting to bring globalization in. Fast forward to the present, and Africa's economies are still extractive zones for minerals, including fossil fuels, and that's on the slide there. All of this is brought into sharper focus with regard to South Africa as a case study in this conjuncture and in my own research. There have been rival interpretations of the post-apartheid order, which includes perspectives on the continuities of settler colonialism, the apartheid economy, and racial capitalism. While I agree the past is implicated in the present, many of these frameworks do not strike the right analytical balance between structure and agency to make intelligible the post-apartheid condition. We need a more honest reckoning with what happened in our country over the past 3 decades of ANC rule. Put more strongly, we cannot give the past an overdetermining role in the present such that a degenerate African nationalism is left off the hook. Making this patently clear is Zuma and his cronies who had their hands in the cookie jar of public finance while blaming apartheid for our woes. Moreover, these macro-theoretical frameworks appreciate historical continuities, but they fail to appreciate historical discontinuities. Specifically, African majoritarian rule has prevailed for 3 decades. For most of this time, the ANC, in alliance with the SACP and COSATU, has received overwhelming electoral mandates to transform the lives of ordinary South Africans. Yet, it would seem the radical aspirations, dreams, and desires of the majority are far from being realized. We have to critically explain this. My own approach to the South African transition is grounded in Antonio Gramsci's theory of passive revolution, to understand a revolution without a revolution, in which there is a non-hegemonic form of capitalist class rule, a form of class rule not for the working class. How such a form of class rule is made is central to the remit of my analysis. Passive revolution as a form of class rule exists between consent and coercion and is a form of corruption fraud. I found this analytical approach the most compelling way to explain the neoliberalization of post-apartheid South Africa through examining how the deep globalization of South Africa's accumulation model, state formation, state-civil society relations, and international relations were remade while the cult of the National Democratic Revolution was venerated at high pitch in the post-apartheid transition. Passive revolution is also not about arguing for violent revolution, but as an interpretive criteria, attempts to understand how potentials for historical transformation are contained, eviscerated, and even neutralized. Such an analysis shows how class rule works through conjunctural historicization and analytical dissection of the neoliberal shift, the conditions it engendered for the emergence of a non-hegemonic bloc, and how state-civil society relations are disabled. Under Thabo Mbeki, the non-hegemonic bloc crystallized to include transnational capital, sections of the media, economists working for capital, state managers, parastatals, the dominant middle-class faction in the ANC, the World Bank, the IMF, WTO, and World Economic Forum, who all championed the deep globalization of the South African economy. The dialectic of inward/outward, deracialization/re-racialization underpinned this class project of capitalist modernity. Deep globalization has been the epitome of coloniality, in which a dominant African nationalism believed Euro-America and transnationalizing capital would bring liberation. This has been the case for 3 decades. To maintain its grip on power, the ANC-led alliance has utilized mythic historical representations, propaganda, co-option, division, rampant looting, and patronage networks. Corruption has criminalized politics to the point where transactional kickbacks to the ruling party have become standard practice. Assassinations of whistleblowers are now a feature of our criminalized politics. This is the materiality of how radical social forces and potentials were conscripted to the passive revolution of deep globalization. As the Afro-neoliberal globalization project failed and national liberation politics degenerated into brazen criminalization under Zuma, the state remained transnationalized. My contribution to the debates about hegemony versus passive revolution are published in Volume 1 of the Democratic Marxism series. My writings in the Love Letter to the Many and my contribution to Volume 8 in the DM series on racism after apartheid advanced this kind of decolonial perspective on the post-apartheid transition. The latter DM volume on racism after apartheid highlights how a highly unequal society engenders new racialized fault lines, racism after apartheid. Even through this critical optic, the ANC-led national liberation movement, ostensibly committed to non-racialism, produced hideous antinomies of more racism, such as xenophobia and exclusionary nationalism. Ultimately, South Africa's passive revolution produced a society in which labor was defeated. Its class project, expressed through an alliance between COSATU, the ANC, and SACP, the Reconstruction and Development Program, and its democratic corporatist framework, was systematically eclipsed as labor was co-opted, divided, and compromised. This is the crux of the passive revolution. The loss of the strategic initiative by labor and its institutional weakening has fed into the development of the post-apartheid crisis. A society brutalized by apartheid has been ravaged by the vagaries of marketization, exclusion, and inequality, while a few made excessive wealth gains. My collaborative work in this regard highlighted the need to bring back class analysis, to ask what color is class, what gender and ecological relations was it intertwined with in the post-apartheid social formation. To also foreground how inequality is implicated in the crisis of social reproduction. Ultimately, a crisis-ridden society was pushed into one of the most extreme and draconian lockdowns during COVID-19. The continuity of Afro-neoliberalism as epidemiological neoliberalism revealed the distance between rulers and led. My article in the Socialist Register shows the problems and limits with how the ANC governed the COVID-19 pandemic. We went into the pandemic with 30 million food insecure, the highest unemployment rate in the world, and failing public health care. This was a spectacular display of failed political leadership and an uncaring ruling class. Imagine going into a world of climate breakdown with this kind of leadership. Ultimately, we have come through 3 decades of ANC rule with COSATU a shadow of itself. In a co-edited monograph based on interviews with 600 shop stewards, the erosion of worker control, shrinking of shop steward councils, and the increasing bureaucratization of COSATU became apparent. Business unionism, union investment companies, increasing control by the SACP, and the end of transformative strategic thinking seems to characterize COSATU. The edited volume, COSATU in Crisis, was banned at a COSATU Congress by the president of COSATU, and workers were called on not to read the book. However, at the same time, state-civil society relations began to expressly reflect the criminalization of social forces by the state. The Marikana massacre was a watershed conjunctural development in this regard. Moreover, the rise of student resistance to achieve decommodified higher education, decolonization, and insourcing was historic. However, while these issues have been important and have gained wide resonance, the violence waged on our universities also brought its challenges. Ultimately, social media choreographed crowd politics showed its problems and limits even during the July 2021 violence. The passive revolution in South Africa is also about the crisis of political subjectivity. And from this perspective, the reactionary nature of ANC nationalism is palpable. However, a crisis-ridden South Africa is merely an expression of a larger planetary crisis. I retitled this slide, but it is from a presentation made by Johann Rockström, the famous climate and earth scientist. He spoke at a conference in Berlin, to which I was also invited to speak on climate justice. He generously shared his slides. The point about this is that we are now shifting the state of the earth. The use of oil, coal, and gas for the past 150 years is rupturing the earth system and placing us in a no-analog condition. We are leaving behind about 10,000 years of a relatively stable climate. Since 2015, we have started living on a new planet after planetary temperature exceeded 1 degree Celsius since the Industrial Revolution. Given this reality, our central problematic for academic research and thought is the planetary problematic. Now, how did I develop a perspective on the planetary polycrisis of socio-ecological reproduction, or simply the last great dispossession of the commons? 4 important intellectual engagements helped elaborate this perspective beyond the famous economic historian at Columbia University, Adam Tooze's flirtatious and perfunctory approach to the syllogism polycrisis on behalf of his Davos friends in the World Economic Forum. First, working with the methodological insight that capitalism has had 4 great crises: the late 19th century, the interwar years, early 1970s, and circa the mid-2000s onwards. And that each of these general crisis moments have to be studied and understood on their own terms. This has also taken me beyond the short-run cyclical crisis tendencies of capitalism and classical interpretive criteria of over-accumulation or underconsumption. Instead, analytically, the emphasis has been on how global expansion of accumulation over the past 4 decades has unleashed systemic crisis tendencies and how these start to connect and interlock in the mid-2000s. Financialization, food system shocks, resource overshoot, and the securitizing of fragile market democracies. The second volume in the Democratic Marxism series, published in 2015, Capitalism's Crises, furnishes a perspective on the civilizational scale of capitalist crisis. Second, through collaborations with about 28 political ecologists in the global north and south, we wrote a journal article challenging but not rejecting the planetary boundaries framework. We argued that the planetary boundaries framework does not recognize the commons basis of our planet, and it also includes social boundaries based on inequality. This paper has been translated into Spanish and Chinese. Third, working as a collaborator for the past 2 years within the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment, a standalone project linked to the UN Foundation, together with colleagues in our working group on systemic risk assessment, we published a paper this year providing a methodological framework to study the cascading and systemic interlocks of polycrisis. The fourth intellectual intervention on framing a perspective on planetary crisis, which goes the furthest, is a forthcoming book with Professor Michelle Williams. It is in this book we argue for a rupture, like Dipesh Chakrabarty, with humanocentric categories like the nation state and global to understand the planetary problematic. In this monograph, we argue capitalism's post-nature triumphalism is really about the annihilation of the background conditions that enable its own existence. Capitalism's clash with the planet and its last great dispossession of the planetary commons through its logic of accumulation through ecocide is now soliciting a response from the earth through climate extremes and polycrisis systems failure. In short, capitalism is inducing a polycrisis of planetary socio-ecological reproduction and is endangering all life on planet Earth. The discipline of international relations cannot understand the planetary problematic because of its state-centric and anthropocentric myopia. It cannot grasp that the Earth is no longer static wallpaper, a dependent variable. The Earth now has agential power and is present in terrifying ways in our lived realities. International relations as a Western supremacist discipline is ontologically incapable of grasping the planetary. This is my argument in the Oxford Encyclopedia of International Studies. At the same time, the rise of Anthropocene discourse over the past few decades amongst geographers, earth and climate scientists operates at a level of abstraction that blames all of humanity for the planetary problematic. Inadvertently, this generic anthropos, humans, does not provide an adequate explanation from a decolonial perspective. What it occludes is that the extant reality of a Euro-American world, its global monopolies, its extractive systems, its knowledge infrastructures, and imperial control built up over 500 years are now life-threatening. It is cause and effect of the planetary crisis, and it has power over our life worlds. This is coloniality writ large in the planetary crisis. Moreover, when looking at the actual evidence around the making of the climate crisis, the following stands out in terms of coloniality. First, when periodizing imperialism from Pax Britannia of the mid to late 19th century to present-day neoliberal global governance, how fossil fuel corporations and imperial power have worked together to lock in carbon capitalism is striking. More recently, the US under Obama, Biden, and Trump accelerated fossil fuel extraction through fracking, such that the US has become a crucial geopolitical player in controlling and influencing the global oil supply in its own right. This is not acknowledged by Anthropocene discourse. When looking at emissions inequality, it is patently clear from various studies that the wealthy are responsible for carbon emissions in countries, both in the global north and south. South Africa is a striking example in this regard. This is not acknowledged by Anthropocene discourse. There are more arguments to make that highlight the coloniality of both Anthropocene discourse and the discipline of IR in the context of the planetary crisis. But let me add the failure of Westphalian institutional structures like the UN system and nation states to address the worsening climate and planetary crisis over the past 3 decades by normalizing it through performative processes, weak mechanisms like the Paris Climate Agreement, and letting fossil fuel corporations escape responsibility, which merely intensifies the coloniality of the planetary crisis. The planet needs post-normal politics that places us all on a climate emergency footing now. The coloniality of the planetary crisis is not just expressed through Anthropocene discourses, a Western supremacist IR discipline, and constant attempts to normalize the planetary crisis, rather than deal with its root causes, but is now increasingly expressed through the second coming of fascism. In 2019, Professor Christopher Chase Dunn, an American sociologist and leading world systems thinker, and I co-edited a special issue of the Canadian Review of Sociology on Old and New Fascism. We had 2 concerns. First, liberal approaches to fascism merely used a checklist of criteria, violence, big men, etc., to classify fascism, which was methodologically inadequate. Second, liberalism did not have a historical understanding of longue durée histories of the right and historical continuities and discontinuities. Our collection brings these issues to the fore, highlighting the role of the fortgate crisis of capitalism, fundamentalist religion, and ecological crisis, playing a part in the second coming of fascism, and in my contribution, rethinking from a decolonial perspective the history of authoritarianism in the global south during the Cold War as forms of fascism. In other words, fascism emerges as part of the crisis conjunctures of capitalism. It is a tendency seeking a monopoly on state power to protect key institutions of capitalism, and as historical specificity that has to be studied in situ. In this regard, I use the EFF as a case study. Building on this work on the second coming of fascism has been volume 6 in the Democratic Marxism series titled Destroying Democracy, published in 2021. In this co-edited volume, we highlight how market democracies is a historically specific form of democracy which allows the power of capital to prevail over the state, society, and nature, was now shifting to more neo-fascist and authoritarian forms of politics. My own chapter deals with the eco-fascism of ruling classes regarding the climate crisis. Volume 8 in the Democratic Marxism series, published this year, titled Digital Capitalism and Its Limits, shows how the digital shift is converging with both the planetary polycrisis, but is also reinforcing the shift to a new fascism in which privacy is lost, post-truth publics are fostered, violence and hate are amplified, and surveillance states are entrenched in failing market democracies. My chapter in the volume on challenges of globalization and prospects for intercivilizational order is about cycles of resistance to US-led neoliberalization. Over the past 4 decades of neoliberal restructuring of the global political economy, salient forms of resistance have come to the fore over 3 cycles of resistance, with the 4th underway. Punctuated by the Caracazo in Venezuela in 1989, resistance to Bretton Woods institutions for food sovereignty, human rights, climate justice, Standing Rock, Fridays for Futures, and many more instantiations of grassroots mass power against the sovereignty of capital. A new global imaginary for emancipatory politics has congealed. Learning from the failures of state-centric socialism in the 20th century and wanting to build another world from below to ensure human and more than human life survive the ecocidal logic of contemporary capitalism. This is where I respectfully part ways with my colleague at WITS, Professor Achille Mbembe, who believes we are facing the end of our species in the context of the planetary crisis. While this is a prospect, I do not believe this is inevitable. The central question beating at the heart of contemporary resistance is how do we end contemporary ecocidal capitalism before it wipes us all out to the planetary crisis it is accelerating? My invited contribution to the Journal Monthly Review, alongside contributions from Jayati Ghosh, one of the world's leading heterodox economists, and João Pedro Stedile from the Brazilian Landless Peoples Movement and others, is about this. It is a contribution to clarifying where the cycles of resistance should go to. To end capitalism, movements today are firstly going beyond the old reform versus revolution binary of the orthodox left as part of elaborating a new emancipatory or transformative praxis. They are reimagining the political to confront the scale of the planetary crisis. Second, they're also moving beyond the dead ends of post-academic theory, post-modernism, post-colonial, and even post-nature. Instead, new forms of knowledge and praxis-centered emancipatory, transformative theories coming to the fore. I am not going into detail on this tonight, but I will be when giving the keynote address to the South African Critical Theory Society in November. Third, they are ending demarxification. And fourth, as forces of socio-ecological reproduction, such movements are fighting for clear transformative alternatives that bring to the fore planetary care from below. They are engaged in next world making from below to find exits from the planetary crisis and advance emancipatory futures. I have made academic contributions to all these aspects of emergent emancipatory politics and futures making. In the forthcoming book with Professor Michelle Williams titled Worker Cooperatives and Deep Democracy, Transformative Politics and Planetary Care from Below, based on 14 years of research in 15 countries, 148 case studies, and 368 interviews, we theorize emancipatory politics. We use these terms interchangeably, by the way. We look at the ontology, power paradigm, strategic orientation, and agency of this new politics. Grounded in the post-normal frame of politics in which society owns the planetary problems and solutions, the book advances the idea of democratic systemic reforms as the linchpin of a new transformative politics to address the root causes of our planetary crisis, to erode, tame, and exit capitalism. Democratic means society or forces of socio-ecological reproduction drive these processes from below. Systemic is ensuring socio-ecological systems transformation to sustain life, and reforms are about democratizing the state through institutional transformation, policies, and laws. This means new political projects have to come to the fore now, guided by experiential, tacit, and emancipatory knowledge, including in South Africa. All three forms of knowledge are crucial for a new emancipatory politics from below. Goran Thurbon, in his book From Marxism to Post-Marxism, suggests that in the global north, the triangle of what makes up Marxism, a historical social science, a dialectical philosophy, and socialist politics, is broken and very unlikely to recover in the 21st century. In the cycles of resistance and in the global south, however, I would argue the conditions for Marxism to thrive are more favorable. This is despite the erasure of Marxism through demarxification. In South Africa, the crisis of Marxism is synonymous with the crisis of national liberation politics and demarxification in the academy. Since coming into the university space in 2010 at age 40, I was surprised by the extent to which traditions of Marxism related to E.P. Thompson-inspired social history, Polanskian and Althusserian currents, and labor studies had largely vanished. Nonetheless, I do believe, as praxis-centered critical theory, Marxism has a place in the academy and in the current cycles of resistance. In this context, I put together the Democratic Marxism series to continue the project of renewing a praxis-centered Marxism that began in the SACP when I was doing national political education. At that time, my generation was clear we had to move beyond the straitjacket of an orthodox Marxism-Leninism and elaborate our Marxism. The book, New Frontiers for Socialism, Conversations on a Global Journey, was put together in this context. It is a compilation of interviews with leading left and Marxist thinkers in over 9 countries, a decade after the Berlin Wall collapsed. The difference with the SACP moment is that in the academy, I believed a self-reflexive Marxism had to be placed in dialogue with other currents of emancipatory thought as part of the current cycles of resistance. Moreover, the Marxism that had to be elaborated had to break with Eurocentrism, productivism, anti-ecological orientations, jettison notions of dictatorship, and superficial commitments to feminism. In this regard, the plurality of the Marxist tradition had to be explored and accentuated. I have been the editor of the Democratic Marxism series with Wits Press since 2012. I have led this research project with an emphasis on conjunctural analysis and strong normative commitments to achieve a just and transformed socio-ecological order, doing research to transform the system. My approach to Marxism has been to treat it as part of a critical theory research program and as a critical social scientist and activist scholar with over 4 decades of activist involvement. I foregrounded readings of Marx emphasizing decoloniality, his break with epistemological Eurocentrism as part of affirming multilinearity in historical processes, ecology, the key ecological premises of Marxist thought, social reproduction, recognizing the relationality between the sphere of production and reproduction, non-state centricism, bringing to the fore Marx's approach to the commons, cooperatives, socialization, and radical democracy as expressed through his support for the Paris Commune and ethics. This is a 21st century reading of Marx, informed by lessons of Marxist praxis over 2 centuries, and positions the inheritance of Marxism within a decolonial, eco-feminist Marxist frame. There are 8 volumes in the Democratic Marxism series, all open access, with over 75,000 downloads. Volume 8 on digital capitalism and its limits, as mentioned, was published in early 2025, and Volume 9 on rethinking the state is in process. The series has contributed to the tree of emancipatory praxis, specifically emancipatory thought. Personally, it heartens me to know the series provided a platform for younger scholars, including Black scholars, to contribute to this project. There has been significant international recognition for the Democratic Marxism series and my editing role. The series has received endorsements from some of the leading public intellectuals and Marxist thinkers in the world. For instance, Naomi Klein, one of the leading public intellectuals in the global north, provided an endorsement for Volume 3 in the series on the climate crisis. She had this to say: features some of the best thinking we have from the climate justice forces mapping the way to the next world. The series has also received endorsements from Samir Amin, one of Africa's leading critical intellectuals and world systems thinkers, and Jeremy Corbyn, former leader of the UK Labour Party, amongst others. In the cycles of resistance today, a new transformative imaginary has been coming to the fore, emphasizing systemic alternatives to advance planetary care from below. These are new historical subjects, forces of socio-ecological reproduction, seeking to enable life and counter the ecocidal logic of capitalism. Such forces have also transformed the meaning of the political beyond normal politics. Moreover, elites, power structures, and ruling classes do not have the monopoly of futures making. The articulation of these alternatives demonstrates other possibilities, other ways of organizing socio-ecological reproduction and arranging society. They are horizons, beacons of hope in the midst of the planetary crisis. In 2019, when I secured a $1 million Mellon grant, I deepened my focus on subaltern world making in the midst of the planetary crisis. This has been an exciting journey with students and collaborators transgressing and thinking across disciplinary boundaries and beyond academic knowledge. It has also been about building a knowledge infrastructure and collaborations that validates subaltern knowledge. This year, my Mellon project ends, but I hope that the knowledge generated makes a difference in how we think and act on the planetary problematic. My contribution to this research agenda on subaltern world making includes the following: advancing research and thinking on solidarity, economy, and cooperative praxis. Such values-based institutions embody solidarity and care as they provision for needs. There is a 150-year history of modern cooperatives, but coupled with deeper histories of solidarity and cooperation, which has been a defining feature of our species, these forms of transformative praxis challenge the competitive and hyper-individualistic logics of ecocidal capitalism. Understanding the conditions that enable this has been central to my research. Food sovereignty is an idea championed by the largest social movement on planet Earth, La Via Campesina, with over 200 million members. As a co-founder of the Food Sovereignty Campaign in South Africa, we have been translating this idea into our context over the past 10 years to advance food sovereignty pathways in villages, towns, and cities. My academic research has supported this process by clarifying how food sovereignty needs to be grounded in conceptual understandings of food inequality a much more relational approach than a technocratic food security approach. Moreover, the Food Sovereignty Campaign, alongside its pathway building work, is championing bottom-up a People's Food Sovereignty Act and policy for South Africa, which has been taken twice to South Africa's parliament to help it imagine a triple transition to a food sovereignty common system in the context of the planetary crisis. At WITS, I initiated the food sovereignty process 10 years ago out of my teaching and got my students to set up a garden. Today, in collaboration with the WCCO, we have 2 food sovereignty hubs that feed about 1,000 students a day. We manage about 6 agroecology gardens. We held a once-a-month farmers market before COVID-19, have employed an agroecology farmer, set up a seed bank, and an activist training center. We are slowly building a food sovereignty common system at WITS to demonstrate another food paradigm to society. The concept of the commons is central to a decolonial Marxism and emancipatory praxis. I provided a reading of Marx that takes us beyond a state-centric conception of socialism towards a deep democracy and commons-centered approach. In other words, recognizing that Marx's ecology is not just about the notion of the metabolic rift, but that the ecological premises in Marx's thought and some of his central political economy categories are also about defending and advancing the commons. At the same time, our forthcoming book on worker cooperatives and deep democracy demonstrates this even more theoretically and empirically. Through my EFS project, I partnered with the Food Sovereignty Campaign, COPAC, and various sectors in society to develop the world's first climate justice charter. Together with contributions from colleagues at GCI, we also took a climate crisis future document online to Parliament on October 16, 2020. We asked Parliament to affirm our right as citizens, as per Section 234 of the South African Constitution, which allows for charters to be adopted. And we wanted our rulers to recognize the urgency of climate science. We are heating at twice the global average, are facing serious risks to our food and water systems, and possible day zeros, including in Gauteng. Our call to place the country on a climate emergency footing and embrace post-normal politics has been ignored. Nonetheless, the Climate Justice Charter movement is finding its way to advance a notion of climate justice as social and earth justice. So wonderful to see many of you wearing your CJCM t-shirts tonight. Now, sharing the wealth created in society as a commons is a powerful idea to address inequality. Supporting calls for a universal basic income in my academic work has been crucial, including supporting the publication of a book by a student on the UBI through its press and through an EFS grant. Again, it's a pity our rulers have not listened. Highlighting that feminism from below, a 4th wave of emancipatory feminism, was building a next world was crucial in Democratic Marxism, Volume 8. From women working in more than 15 countries on the continent, to women in Rojava, to women in coal fields trying to go beyond coal-based imaginaries, exciting world-making practices have been coming to the fore that we can all learn from. The state has been hollowed out and remade by the neoliberal class project. The volume on the developmental state was put together in 2014 before my EFS project, and it brought together some of the leading thinkers on the developmental state, such as Peter Evans, Sean O'Rian, and Chinquan Lee. This volume unsettles model thinking on the developmental state. In this case, the book challenges mere copying or even selective copying of aspects of the Chinese state, as it was formed under very specific conditions. However, the volume argues for democratizing logics, understanding the limits of expert policy design, and human empowerment to be central to 21st century conceptions of the developmental state. Forthcoming is Volume 9, the last in the Democratic Marxism series, which seeks to rethink the state in the context of the planetary crisis, disaster, complexity, and just transitions. A crucial argument in the volume is for climate emergency social contracts to come to the fore, to place societies on a post-normal footing to tackle the planetary crisis of capitalism. This volume argues that global rivalries are intensifying in the competition-centered US-led world order. This volume was published in 2020 before the Russian invasion of Ukraine and declarations of a Third World War. The argument in this volume is that the decline and crisis of US hegemony is a dangerous moment in world history. It's a transition moment which could lead to wars and greater conflicts. Instead of vaunting the BRICS as the answer, the volume makes the case for the renewal of people-to-people internationalism from below to secure just world peace. Such people-to-people internationalism can also amplify planetary care from below and emancipatory politics. The flotilla making its way to Gaza calls for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, and calls for South Africa to stop exporting coal to Israel are all powerful expressions of people-to-people solidarity that we must support. Finally, my work has contributed to reimagining socialism in the 21st century as decolonial, deeply democratic, ecological, and feminist. All the emancipatory alternatives and propositions shared above need to be crystallized into a new political project, including in South Africa. A post-national liberation, post-Soviet, and post-social democratic left alternative with a new identity, imaginary, and praxis is possible. The question is whether political subjectivity takes us there before it is too late. This is a question that each of you and history will answer. I came to the academy at age 40, rather late, and after being defeated politically in the SACP, I do not have any regrets for standing up to the opportunistic and destructive Zuma bandwagon. At the same time, I never expected to be an academic or professor in my life. It's been an exciting journey, contributing to training the next generation of critical intellectuals in South Africa. I do believe critical intellectuals seeds have been sown, and they will continue to germinate. In coming years, when the planet overshoots 1.5 degrees Celsius and Southern Africa heats at 3 degrees, given that it is heating at twice the global average, I can confidently tell my students there was a serious effort to advance post-normal emancipatory politics to ensure multi-generational justice. In this spirit, I want to use this opportunity to make 3 requests to WITS to play its part in confronting the coloniality of the planetary crisis and ensuring climate justice is mainstreamed as post-normal politics in the country. First, I call upon WITS University and its leadership to convene a societal summit to share the urgencies of climate science, developed by the likes of GCI, with society. This must not be done with the ineffective Presidential Climate Commission, but as WITS. Second, WITS should collaborate with USAF, HSRC, NIHSS, and other institutions in the higher education space to set up provincial nodes of technical knowledge support, including geographers, climate scientists, critical social scientists, and more, to work with communities, workplaces, and sectors to provide knowledge for transformative adaptation, mitigation, and regeneration of life-enabling systems. And third, for WITS to support calls for and become a champion for climate emergency social contract for society, to accelerate the deep just transition now. I hope the management of the university receives these suggestions in a collegial spirit, coming out of years of serious research, trying to figure out ways to exit and survive the planetary crisis. Deriving from my work are 3 themes that I will continue to work on: decolonial IR, including decolonial Marxism, the climate polycrisis, and emancipatory Earth relations, futures, and politics. This will certainly entail doing more than collective knowledge production, but will entail writing my own books. Now to the thank yous. Firstly, a big thanks to all attendees in person and online for making the time to hear me drone on for the past 45 minutes. The congratulatory messages received have also been heartwarming. Thank you. Secondly, to all my students, including the 35 in the EFS cohort, it has been a privilege to engage you and learn from you. I believe in lifelong learning, and so each of you has added something to my knowledge archive. Thirdly, to my IR department and colleagues, I appreciate the space and support given to advance my teaching, research, and writing projects. Also, a special thanks to the VC, Professor Morris, the Dean, Prof. Muswana, and Head of School, Prof. Nunez, for convening this inaugural lecture. A special thanks to Kelabogile Etladi and others in the administration for their work on organizing this inaugural event. To Prof. Colleen Vogel, who will give the vote of thanks, I wanted someone like you, far from the Faculty of Humanities, a woman sitting in the hotbed of climate science research to play the role you're playing tonight, because my work has also been about building bridges across disciplines to confront the planetary crisis. Fourth, a special thanks to all my international collaborators, including funders, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, the EMS Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and the NIHSS. Fifth, to all my book publishers, but specifically WITS University Press, A special thanks for supporting the Democratic Marxism series for more than a decade. It is bittersweet for me to end the series after volume 9, but new research interests beckon. 6, to all the bright, passionate, and politically conscious staff at the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center, whose board I chair, your work inspires me. The WCCO at WITS, Karuna Singh and her team, we have come a long way with our food sovereignty work. Dynamic partnership and collaboration has brought us this far and will certainly take us further. 7th, to all the activists, movements, and comrades, it's been an honor to walk the path with you to confront the coloniality of the planetary crisis and advance emancipatory politics from below. 8th, to my late parents who started their professional careers as teachers and imbued our family with a deep passion for knowledge and learning. This would certainly have been a proud moment for them, having the first professor in their immediate and extended families. I know this is a proud moment for my siblings, friends, and family in California. Thank you to my eldest brother Kiran for making the trip from Pietermaritzburg to be here this evening, and my sister Ujala, the pillar of strength in our family, who wanted to be here, but who is currently co-organizing a conference in Cape Town. Finally, to my partner Michelle, whose brilliance, care, and uncompromising love brought me into the academy. Without her prompting, I would not be standing before you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this brilliant inaugural lecture, Vishwas, who showed us in depth and extends the work that you do globally. And if there is anything that comes to mind listening to you, is this idea of a puzzle, and how each one of the parts that you're putting together help us make sense of the complexity of the world we are in and the interrelation of all these parts. You are a critical thinker. I celebrate you for that, but also for your commitment to make changes from below, right? To care for the planet. You mentioned it a number of times. Planet care from below. And to work with the students, to empower them and make them aware of the possibilities of change, along with an understanding of the complexity of the world we live in. And so on behalf of WITS, I'd like to give you this little present here. And on behalf of the School of Social Sciences, I have another present, which is a shell. And I hope this shall represent our intention to embrace what you bring to us, climate, the awareness on nature, and to think with nature. Thank you so much. And I'd like to invite and introduce a distinguished professor, Colleen Vogel, professor at the University of Witwatersrand and a trained climatologist who now focuses on the social dimensions of climate change adaptation. She serves on several local and international boards and has chaired key global environmental science committees that preceded Future Earth. In South Africa, she was lead contributor to the Disaster Management Act. Internationally, she has contributed as a lead author of the IPCC 4th and 5th assessment report and the IPBES Transformative Assessment. These are intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Her work has earned her the Burtoni Award for Excellence in Adaptation Research and the WITS Vice Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. Welcome, Prof. Colleen.
Professor Lynn Morris, Professor Mucha Musemwa, Professor Lorena Nunes Carrasco, colleagues and friends, and in particular those who are online. Wow, what an inaugural that brought together a huge range of issues. From an international relations background, Vishwas has spent many years, as you've seen, even though he says he only came here at 40. He must have been thinking of many of these things before 40. He's been dealing with these political economy themes on various issues, as you saw, including digital capitalism, how timeous, feminism, the role of cooperatives in South Africa, economic pathways, who controls those and what are the agendas, and also on inequality and on climate justice. But he comes and brings with it a deep sense of colonial relations. He has supervised, as you've seen, a number of students. He's had grants from very prestigious institutions like Brown University and Kassel University. But what draws me to Vish, last but not least, is that he's an agent provocateur. He provokes, and he provokes not only verbally, but he has an incredible skill to provoke also in the written word. And as we've heard tonight, it's really an immense tour de force that he has accomplished in many of his publications. But for me, Vishwas is not only a critical thinker and a writer and an agent provocateur, but he helps us to think differently. He also embodies for me what I think it means to be a pracademic. We don't have many pracademics around, I think, because we sometimes get too theoretical. But Vish actually uses his academics and his theoretical knowledge to actually deal with some very profound issues, as you've seen tonight. Food sovereignty, transformation and critique, complex Marxism, bringing in and juxtaposing social theory with dimensions of polycrisis in which we live. It's a huge entanglement, and to navigate your way through that takes a real sense of what you have and what you know and how you want to communicate it. Professor Morris asked me outside, perplexed, I think, why are you here, in a way? I'm in the science faculty, and I trained as a climate scientist, but thank goodness for Vish, because he's a provocateur in the climate change field and in the Global Change Institute, where many of my colleagues are actually climate modelers. I myself trained as a climate scientist, but he brings in a light and a lens which really causes us to sit up and to really delve into the drivers of social dimensions of change. He brings in that light and enables us to look into the shadows, and in particular, to get rid of some of our blind spots. And we really need that. And as you've seen, we've been very privileged to work with him in climate justice, working on some of the global governance issues that he's been writing about and what we've been able to privileged, if you like, read about, and also his work on social justice. But I think the critical questions, and I want to thank him for that, and thank the university for making him a professor, is that he asks some really critical questions of our time at the moment. How can we live justly, you heard him say, in the planetary commons? What is climate breakdown, and who will have to bear that? And how can we do this as the window is rapidly closing? Vish, this is a wonderful achievement for you, for Michelle, for your family, for the Wits family, who we want to thank for enabling you to do this work and to really support you in your work. And also we want to thank your friends and your colleagues across the world. You don't just work in a local space. You work very tangentially, you're transgressive, you really cross the boundaries, not only of disciplines, but also across continents. I want to wish you, and I'm sure the rest of the university and your friends here want to wish you all the very best in your career. However, I have to add, may you continue to provoke. Not only publish, but provoke, because you do that so well in the written word and in the spoken word. I know we have to publish, but I think the provocation is what is so rich, because we need that critical element, particularly in this planetary discourse, in the geopolitical space that we find ourselves in, and also in a world that is breaking and crumbling, in many cases biodiversity-wise and also climate-wise. But I don't know if many of you know, but Vish is also a poet. He has written some reflections, and I take liberty to quote from him, from his work. He says, "With the passage of time, my consciousness has changed. Days of political adventure are ending, I hope not. Like an old wine, my beliefs have matured. May they continue. I want to confront history," and that's what his last call was to us. "But," and here's the interesting point, "with the patience of a gardener, I want to contribute to history." Help us, Vish, please, to continue to garden with you. Help us to stand up for the truth, and help us in particular to garden and to develop that planetary care that you've spoken so honestly about. Tonight has indeed been a humbling and a privilege. Thank you, Vish, and all the best. I believe I'm supposed to now invite everyone outside for refreshments, so please do join us out in the foyer, and all travel home safely and enjoy a good discussion outside. Thank you very much.